This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitsuhone have in store?
Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. It's also October, and that means this is a Halloween-inspired MTG Top 10. In this video, we're going to look at the best cards from Shadows over Innistrad. Innistrad is one of the Halloweeniest planes in the entire game. It is a gothic horror-inspired plane where werewolves, vampires, ghosts, and zombies are commonplace, and it may just be my favorite plane in all of Magic. In the past, in October, I've looked at both original Innistrad and Dark Ascension, and now Shadows over Innistrad is far enough in our past that we have some actual meaningful data to look at. As we will see, Shadows over Innistrad was a fairly powerful set, with most of the cards on this list finding success in more formats than just Standard. There is one caveat about this list. A card had to receive its first printing in Shadows over Innistrad to be considered. This means reprints like Deadweight or Lightning Axe were not eligible for this list. Anyway, Shadows over Innistrad has over 300 cards that were eligible for this list, and in this video, I'm going to look at the 10 that have left the largest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's look at number 10, where we have Thalia's Lieutenant. At its core, Shadows over Innistrad, and really most Innistrad sets, are largely based around tribes. In the introduction, I mentioned some of the spookier tribes, but Innistrad also has humans, which are represented in the green-white color pair. Thalia's Lieutenant is one of the best human payoffs in the entire game, and I think that's because, unlike some tribal payoffs, it isn't one-dimensional. Sometimes with a card like this, it is completely terrible if you have no humans in play when you play it, but the Lieutenant both likes it when there are humans around when it comes down, and when other humans come into play later. This means that you get a ton of value out of only 2 mana, since it often adds massive amounts of damage to the board. It was played in Standard, in decks with a lot of humans in them like White Weenie and Collected Company. However, despite all the human support in Shadows over Innistrad, human decks weren't exactly dominant in that Standard format, so the Lieutenant only managed 13 points in Standard. Since then though, Thalia's Lieutenant has become a key card in a Tier 1 Modern deck, Humans. As you can probably guess, this deck is loaded up with powerful humans and human payoffs, and the Lieutenant really thrives there. Humans have been a fixture in Modern since 2017, and that isn't going to change anytime soon, so I think Thalia's Lieutenant has a chance to move up this list in the future. At number 9, we have a Planeswalker, Jiri the Harbinger. Jiri is a pretty powerful Planeswalker who starts with high loyalty. If you play her and use her +2 ability, she's already at 6, and that's a ton. In addition to helping improve your draws, she can also remove a number of different types of permanents, and those two things combined often make for a good Planeswalker. Jiri also has a nice ultimate, which in the right deck can search up really frightening creatures who can end the game in a hurry. She was played in a lot of different Standard decks, but Mardu Vehicles is where she was played the most. Vehicles themselves are actually a pretty big part of why she was played so much in Standard, because she could exile the problematic ones, and there were a few of them in that format. She has seen some play in Modern too, most frequently in Jeskai control decks, which usually run something pretty spicy to search up with her, like Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. Jeskai control decks running Jiri haven't managed to put up any points in Modern so far in 2018, but it would be a huge surprise for her to find some success before the year is out either. At number 8, we have a double-faced card, the first of several on this list. It's Duskwatch Recruiter. Double-faced cards were created for the plane of Innistrad, and they work really well flavor-wise there, especially with werewolves like Duskwatch Recruiter. The Recruiter is a pretty great value engine, and both sides of it synergize quite well with one another. While not in full-on werewolf mode, you have a 2-mana 2/2 who can give you some serious card selection and card advantage. Once he transforms, he then makes it so all the extra creature spells he drew for you are cheaper to cast. He saw a ton of play while in Standard, most frequently in Collected Company decks. The Recruiter is great there because he can be put into play with Collected Company and give you a ton of value, but his activated ability is almost like a miniature Collected Company. Letting you dig through your library for toolbox creatures is pretty nice. He has also seen some play in modern creature toolbox decks that also run Collected Company. At number 7, I have Traverse the Ulvenwald. Tutor effects tend to be pretty powerful, and Traverse is no exception to that. Sure, if you don't get Delirium going, you can only tutor up basic lands, but that's the fail case here, and it's kind of a reasonable one. It's the kind of card that can let you keep one land hands pretty easily. Once you get Delirium going though, you can pay a single green mana to tutor up any land, basic or otherwise, or any creature. That's some serious business. Delirium was a mechanic people were building around in Standard, most successfully in Golgari decks, and it wasn't that hard to get it going quickly, so Traverse was featured in those decks. It has also seen play in Modern, specifically in Death's Shadow decks. It makes especially good sense there because the deck is so reliant on getting Death's Shadow into play and going for a quick kill, and the deck is already interested in loading up its graveyard for various other purposes. Traverse essentially gives the deck extra copies of Death's Shadow that can be tutored up at the opportune time, and that's pretty great. Traverse Shadow decks haven't put up any great finishes so far in 2019, and it does seem like Death's Shadow decks have moved over into being Grixis or Mardu lately, which might not be good for Traverse going forward. At number 6, it is Thing in the Ice. This was one of the most hyped cards in the entire set, and I think we can say that, since it's on the list, it probably lived up to the hype. A super powerful spell build around, Thing in the Ice can block some guys early before transforming into a Woken Horror, who then bounces everything that isn't a horror, while also bringing some impressive stats. Good spell decks can flip this in a hurry, and transforming it is one of the biggest tempo plays around. In Standard, Thing in the Ice was primarily played as a win condition in Izzet control decks, but it didn't find a ton of success in the format, only managing 7 points there. Thing in the Ice has seen play in Modern pretty much from the start, appearing in decks like Jeskai Pyromancer and Blue Moon back in 2016, and more recently showing up in Izzet Phoenix decks, which specialize in casting a ton of spells in the early game, something that Thing in the Ice is always happy about. Izzet Phoenix decks have been considerably weakened by the banning of Faithless Looting, so it'll be interesting to see if Thing in the Ice still has a home in Modern going forward. Even if it can't find a home in Modern though, Thing in the Ice does see play in Vintage, a format where it is very easy to quickly flip it, primarily in decks built around fellow spell payoff, Monastery Mentor. Thing in the Ice is the card on the list to put up the most points so far in 2019, with 22 points, so it stands to reason that it will move further up this list in the future. At number 5 is Westville Abbey, which transforms into the frightening Ormondal Profane Prince. Westville Abbey is great for the same reason most good non-basics are great. It can produce mana for you early, like any other land would be able to, but then in the late game it gains some serious utility, between being able to produce creature tokens and then being able to transform into a creature that is pretty difficult to do anything about, especially because it has haste and will be smashing face right away while its owner gains a ton of life. Westville Abbey also benefits from the fact that it is colorless, meaning that any deck that has tons of creatures can play it and have Ormondal as a plan B that they keep in their back pocket. This means that tons of aggressive decks ran this in Standard. This included more combo-focused Cryptolith Right decks, but also more traditional aggro decks like White Weenie, Selesnya Tokens, and Mono Black Zombies. It also has a couple of points in Modern, where it has been played in both Collected Company and Elf decks. Westville Abbey is another card on this list that hasn't put up any points so far in 2019. At number 4, it is Thraben Inspector. This is a card that flew under the radar for just about everyone, but it turned out to be good enough to see a lot of play in Standard. In general, people really underrated clues, something I think has repeated itself with Food and Throne of Eldraine. Having built-in mana sinks that make sure you keep drawing extra cards is pretty good, especially when a creature is reasonably efficient like Thraben Inspector. It also didn't hurt that it was a human, because that means it could be extra effective in decks running Thalia's Lieutenant. In addition to being played in those human aggro decks in Standard, it also saw play in tons of other decks running White too. It was pretty close to being a staple in the format. One deck that could get particularly good value out of it were the more artifact-based aggro decks like Mardu Vehicles and Mardu Ballista, where the Inspector gave you a body that could crew your vehicles and give you additional artifacts for your payoffs. The Inspector has also seen a little bit of play in Modern, where it shows up in some human decks, but the vast majority of those decks don't run the Inspector. As a result, the Inspector isn't putting up a ton of points right now, and its spot on this list could be in peril in the future. At number 3, we have a powerful removal spell, Declaration in Stone. This has a particularly interesting use of the Investigate mechanic. It is the built-in downside to the spell here, because if it was just 1 in a white to exile anything, that would be a little bit too powerful, at least for most standard formats. Even with that downside though, Declaration in Stone was one of the most played cards in Shadows over Innistrad Standard, because it was arguably the best removal spell in the format. Basically, any white deck was playing Declaration in Stone, especially more aggressive decks that could kill their opponent before the extra card you give them matters. Despite all that success in Standard, Declaration in Stone is the only card on this list that has never gotten any points in a format other than Standard. This is because it isn't nearly as powerful as similar spells that are legal in other formats, like Path of Exile. At number 2, it is Archangel Allison, a card that was pushed incredibly hard to be great in Standard, and they definitely succeeded there. A 5-mana 4/4 with flash and flying, and the ability to make your guys indestructible is absolutely absurd, and it definitely makes the OG 5-mana 4/4 flyer with vigilance, Sarah Angel, pretty sad about things. Anyway, Avison's upside doesn't even end there. She can also transform into a larger creature who does 3 damage to the whole board. The design there is kind of cool because you don't have complete control over when that happens, and your opponent could potentially take advantage of it, but you're still kind of coming out ahead since you have a huge flyer that will survive the effect no matter what, while also doing 3 damage to everything. Like Declaration in Stone and Thraben Inspector, Archangel Allison also appeared in just about every white deck in Standard. She could operate as a win condition for control decks, or as more of a top curve threat for more aggressive decks. All of her abilities make it pretty easy to get 2 or even 3-for-1s out of her, while also adding a huge flying win condition to the board. While almost all of Avison's points came in Standard, she also has a lone point in Modern from 2018, where she appeared in a Martyr life gain deck. It doesn't seem completely impossible for her to see more play in Modern in the future, but at the same time, she is expensive enough that I don't think she will ever end up being a card that's heavily played in the format. And at number 1 is the card that just might be my favorite card in the whole set, Tireless Tracker. I mentioned earlier that I love Investigate as a mechanic, and the Tracker is a card advantage engine thanks to its landfall effect putting a clue into play. Even if all the Tracker did was fill the board with clues, it would be great. But it also gets bigger every time you crack one, meaning that it can not only help you find a win condition or removal spells or whatever you need, the Tracker itself can eventually get large enough to be a huge threat all on its own. And the ability to draw extra cards pairs really well with landfall because, well, you're more likely to draw lands the more cards you draw. Tireless Tracker saw a ton of play in Standard, pretty much being featured in any green deck you can imagine, but it has also become an important card in Modern, where it has been featured in a variety of decks, ranging from aggro decks based around Collected Company, to Scapeshift and Primeval Titan combo decks, to more mid-rangey decks like Jund or The Rock. It has also found some success in Legacy lands, which, as you might have guessed, runs a ton of lands, so the Tracker spits out a ton of clues. Tireless Tracker has proven to be the best card in Shadows over Innistrad based on its considerable multi-format success, and it is hard to imagine any card on this list ever catching up. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. So far, in October, the top 10s have all been on objective topics, but on Wednesday I'll be doing something a little more subjective. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch more MTG Top 10s in the future, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see MTG Top 10s from the past, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Also, if you want to help support the channel, you can check out my Patreon. Any amount of money can help, even a single $1. Thanks for watching.